Political bias at the ABC is never more sensitive than during election campaigns. Last year, we had a close look at the political skewing of their panel show, The Drum. During the 5-week campaign, the show featured 111 panellists, and of those, 77 were left of centre, 20 centrist, and 14 were right of centre. That's nearly 70% from the so-called progressive side of politics and just over 12% from the conservative side. You know, the ones mainstream Australia voted for. That's fair and balanced ABC style. Our analysis was vindicated later that year when an ABC review led by former BBC advisor Kerry Blackburn found evidence of bias on the show. The review said one episode showed not just a positive impression of policies identified with Labor's platform, but also at times a marked enthusiasm for a Labor victory. And another was more than 7 times as likely to contribute to favourable impression of Labor and the left than to a favourable contribution of the coalition and the right. As reported at the time, the review recommended The Drum do better in its panel selection to achieve a better balance of voices from across the spectrum of ideas and politics. 3 years later, we've had another look across 5 weeks of campaigning, and 61 or 55% of The Drum's panellists have been left of centre, with just over half as many, or 30% of panellists, right of centre and 15% neutral or centrist. In other words, nothing has changed. If you're a Conservative panellist on The Drum, you're more likely to be there for sport than for serious discussion. Watch what happens when the panel criticises the coalition for not delivering on its policies and a Liberal makes a counterpoint.
What about winding back the promises that are made? And I cast my mind back to the Bob Hawke line of the 1990 election: no child will live in poverty.
That's very different.
But Michael, this is not extravagant. The aged care policy. Sorry, Michael, the aged care policy.
Yeah, and the hosts prefer a green left view of the world too, with patronising attitudes towards right of centre guests compounding the bias.
Sometimes your own personal political philosophy is more progressive than the federal government, right? On things like climate and gender equality and diversity and accountability. So you're prime to be voting for a Teal independent in a Conservative seat. What would be wrong with that?
When Scott Morrison talks about the Pacific family, does that reak of paternalism to you? Is that sort of great white father stuff?
Of course, no, it absolutely does.
What do you think about this sort of idea that there is a bit of kind of almost sort of old school yellow peril-ism about this? There's that the Chinese just shouldn't be coming into our neck of the woods.
Ah, yes, of course. Australia is paternalistic and racist. This is the same program that couldn't bring itself to mention, not once, the allegations that Labor Senators Penny Wong, Christina Keneally and Katie Gallagher bullied their late colleague Senator Kimberley Kitching. As for the diversity of the panellists, it speaks for itself.
Calling the Greens a crazy leftist fringe-dwelling group is not really reflective of what the Greens actually stand for.
Well, I guess the Greens don't decide who covers them, and we are living in a bit of a murdocracy here.
Many have said that they can't stand Scott Morrison, but do they find Albo prime ministerial enough? And I felt like he demonstrated that actually there is some hope for the future.
Elections are all about swinging voters. Federal ICAC is an important issue, but not to them. They're more concerned with the price of petrol or who's doing what to whom on Married at First Sight.
Part of the reason I suspect that other countries such as China have been able to make inroads is, as was said, that we are seen as being inactive on climate change. And the Pacific countries are the ones who go first.
I believe that Catherine Deves and other people in the Liberal Party continue to have this view that trans women are not women. We are putting trans girls and trans women at risk by this rhetoric.
I think this is such a good policy that you saw this, tsunami of verbal diarrhea from Morrison today attacking the policy.
And if you thought that was blatant bias, well, look at this from just last night from a former ABC presenter, John Fain.
Let's call a spade, Julia. Let's hope things aren't as sleazy under Albanese. You can't deny it. There's been a sleaze problem.
Partisan grubbiness. So much for achieving a better balance of voices from across the spectrum of ideas and politics. If they can't do better at the drum, they ought to just get the boot.